Welcome back to Ken Michaels Radio, where we're always talking about the Beatles here, and we always welcome special guests. Just a few moments ago, this guy was right here on the show. He hasn't changed his clothes, he's in the same room.
Yeah.
We did a show called Beatles Preferences, and he was one of the guests. If you haven't seen that show yet, it's a lot of fun.
Oh,
He
great.
He's written a lot of books on the Beatles, including Liverpool, Birthplace of the Beatles. He might be best known for that one. The Fab 104. Um, what was Liverpool, the Beatles country? Oh, the country of Liverpool.
Comes with Liverpool, yeah.
Liverpool. This is his most recent book called The Beatles, What If? And he co-wrote the book with Andrew Phillips. And this book is all a bunch of scenarios of what might have happened if certain things in the Beatles story did happen or didn't happen. And we've all played these games in our
Yeah,
brains.
exactly.
Some of us don't have a life, but we've all thought of these things at one time or another. And so David wanted to capitalize on all this that we've all been experiencing. And so tell us how this whole idea came about, why you chose to do this.
It actually came up when I was working on Liverpool, like over 20 years ago. When I came across the story of how John and Paul met. Of course, as we know, John was best friends with Ivan Vaughan from the age of 5. John was such a bad boy that Ivan's parents would let him go to the same high school as John.
Right.
So he ends up going all the way into Liverpool City Centre to the Liverpool Institute, ends up in the same class as Paul McCartney. They become friends, and Ivan is the only connection between John and Paul. Otherwise, they don't get together. And I remember finding that out, and that blew my mind all those years ago and thinking, how important was that? So from that day, I started making a list of all these turning points, pivot points in the story of the Beatles. And it was must have been about it's 5 or 6 years ago. So Andrew, my co-author, he and I have been friends for at least 15 years, always meeting up at Beatles festivals and stuff. And we were at the fest over in New Jersey. And in one of those quiet times, we were just chatting, catching up. And we started talking about a couple of these different scenarios. Anyway, half an hour later, we were still talking these through, and I said, I've been making a list of these things for years, and I've always been meaning to put it into a book. What do you reckon? Do you fancy doing this together?
Hmm.
He said, yeah, okay. And that was it. So it just started from this conversation between the two of us. And we're thinking, yeah, no, we could do something with this.
And the
And
great
that
thing
was
is, just off the top of your head, you could probably come up with 20, 30 just to start of all
very easy.
those.
Yeah. So I ended up a list of over 300 key moments all the way through. And one of the decisions, because we had to think, we don't want to keep this not too complicated. Um, and for those who maybe aren't as deeply ingrained and sucked into the Beatle world as you and I,
Uh,
if those who maybe have a life and we're thinking, okay, how do we make it so it's readable for those who don't want to get into all the geeky stuff
right.
that you and I love, think, but still make it appealing to those of us who do love that kind of minutiae. And we thought there are so many moments in their childhood, of how John eventually ends up in Woolton and meets those friends, and that has the knock. There are so many just when it was just going to get too complicated. So we
Hmm.
took the decision. So we've got to accept the point that John, Paul, and George get together. We've got to get to that point. Otherwise, you can just go at so many tangents. So, I mean, that's only the end of 1957. So, it's only really not looking too much at their childhood, but we've got those three together. From there were so many moments we were realizing we could go off on one tangent, which will lead to another. And that was another decision we had to take for the discipline was we
Right.
cannot go two steps. It has to be this moment only. Otherwise, you're going, well, if that happened and then that, you just lose it completely.
Right.
So we had to get ourselves quite focused and disciplined, which Andrew's better at than me, which is very, very handy.
And
So,
also, thankfully, because a lot of the research that you've done especially with the Fab 104. There's all these names of people that are not household names to Beatle
No.
fans that spent a brief time with them, getting to know them, playing some part in Beatle history. So you're known for putting out the geeky stuff.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
for you to try to mainstream it might have been difficult for you.
Very.
I've
But it was
also,
fun to do. Fun to do.
yeah, many times I've said that the Beatles story is like a maze, where if you just make one detour, the whole story could have changed for some reason.
Yeah.
But realistically, couldn't you say that about so many bands that have a long history?
Well, I think the great thing was that when Andrew and I were talking about this was that everybody in their life has these key what if moments. We
Mm,
all have them. For me, my big one obviously was being signed off work ill 25 years ago and being told, that's it, we're medically retiring you, go and find something to do. Now, if that hadn't have happened, I would have still been working probably in insurance now. I never would have done any of this stuff. That was such a big moment in my life, which was a complete about turn.
right.
So what I found to do was all this lovely beatly geekly stuff and writing the books and everything else that's come with it. So that was my big moment and the turning point. And when I've been talking to people about the concept, everybody can say, I know exactly in my life this happened and everything changed. So we've all got them,
Yeah,
lots of them. It's part of our everyday life. So
yeah,
that sort of concept hasn't been too hard to put across.
yeah. You changed your misfortune into something beautiful
Yeah,
we all can appreciate.
yeah,
It just entered my brain, the whole thing with Peter Jackson when he was working on Get Back. Originally, it was going to be like 2 hours, but
yeah,
because of COVID,
yeah,
he had all this extra time to work with, and it became 7 hours. So
yeah. Thankfully,
take a sad song and make it better.
exactly. Write
Yeah.
that one down. That could be good. That.
All right, so I figured for this conversation, because there's so many scenarios to get to here, I want to focus a lot on the early years, the very beginning. And
Yeah,
since you mentioned Ivan Vaughn, and
yeah.
I always love saying Ivan and Paul had the same birthday, which is some coincidence, same year.
Same year, exactly.
June 18th. There was this one story I think Paul has said where he spotted John in like a deli or a luncheonette online, but he never spoke to him. So it wasn't like the first time. But I think the first time that they spoke was obviously the July 6th, 1957.
Yeah,
The
it
gar
was. I've actually recently found another moment before the 6th of July meeting as well,
Uh-huh.
where Paul had spotted John. And it's just chatting with a friend of mine, and he was saying he got a copy of the program of when Bill Haley played in Liverpool.
Uh-huh.
And he said, somewhere in my memory, Paul's talks about that. And I thought, "Well, you know what I'm like, so give me a challenge." Off I went. And I found I think it was an interview when the Beatles were in Japan in '66, and Bill Haley came up, and Paul says to John, "Yeah, I went to see him in Liverpool, and John, you were there as well because I saw you." That took place, I think, in February '57. So there's actually now two definite moments. There's when Bill Haley and the Comets were in Liverpool, and this other moment, and it was a news agent where Paul used to do a newspaper round
Uh-huh.
quite close to his house.
Right.
And a friend of mine has actually spoken to the family who owned that where Paul did the paper round and confirmed that that's where it was. And Paul saw John.
But
So again,
did they speak to
no,
each other?
no, that's the whole thing. So I think Paul had seen him and was the kind of guy he was wary of. So it makes it even more brilliant that Ivan was there to bring them together because Paul was wary of him, so wouldn't have approached him. And the whole point is with the geography, they're from different parts of Liverpool, went to different schools, different groups of friends. There's no natural reason for them to come together if it wasn't for Ivan. Massive turn of events. Massive.
We should thank Ivan every day of our lives.
Absolutely right. Absolutely.
Greatest unsung hero in Beatles history.
Yeah.
So here's an obvious question. What if the Beatles hadn't played in Hamburg?
Yes, one of my pet projects. Thank you so much for that one. It's always been one of those stories that I've been so passionate about ever since I first interviewed Alan Williams,
Yeah,
which is 20 years ago, and talking to Alan and realizing how much he's been written out of Beatles history. I mean, and I don't blame Brian because when Brian was packaging the Fab Four and selling them to the world, they were the Beatles, John, Paul, George, and Ringo. He was the manager. Nobody else gets mentioned. And what I've loved doing is finding everything that happened before that and finding those people and realizing how poor the Beatles, Silver Beatles, whatever you called them, in early 1960 were. And probably the best eyewitness I spoke to was Rory Best, who's Pete's brother.
yeah.
So when Pete Best was taken down for the audition, just a couple of days before they head to Hamburg, Rory said, I went down with him and they ran through a few songs. And he said, and I couldn't say it to our Pete, but they were terrible. But that was the reputation they had. They weren't even settled on from Silver Beatles. Beatles had been mentioned, they spelt it differently. They'd only had 3 months before they went to Hamburg playing as a rock and roll group
Right.
and not building a reputation, not playing often enough to get that experience together. Then that journey going over to Hamburg and those months, when they first get on the stage in the
Right.
Indra, they're terrible. And then we get that famous Max Show, make a show. Hamburg's where they learn to be a band, where they learn stagecraft, where they learn how to entertain. Because their job wasn't just to play to a crowd. Their job was to bring punters in from the Große Freiheit into the club to spend the money. They never had to do that before. So it's a different way of thinking.
This was a learning experience for them. But my question is, and I believe that Hamburg is so essential to the Beatles story, but if they had found the right promoter or talent agent in England, couldn't they have gotten further at all? I know how tough it is to go from Liverpool into London,
No,
but
it's not tough. It was impossible.
yeah.
And that was it because everything was localized. So if they hadn't gone to Hamburg, everything sort of it changed. You have to understand the context of what they did in those few months of
Hmm.
being out in Hamburg, because when they come back, all right, there's all those different moments where it could have fallen apart. George comes back to his underage. Pete and Paul are deported.
Hmm.
Has to go and get a job, a proper job. John comes back and doesn't even tell the others he's back. That could have been the end. Very, very much that could have been the end of the Beatles.
Right.
But with Mona Best and Alan Williams, they get them these various gigs. And the big one at Litherland Town Hall on the 27th of December 1960.
Hmm.
This is where it's almost like the modern gig is invented. So, like when Paul Ringo goes on tour, we buy our tickets after saving up for years and getting a mortgage to buy it to go and see them, and you accept you're going to stand or sit and watch them perform.
Hmm.
Back in 1960 in Liverpool, you didn't do that. The groups who were around, and I worked on a list that there was over 300 groups active in Liverpool. There was about 400 live music venues.
Hmm.
Now on the basis London had maybe 100 at the top, our little city had all these venues, but the groups were hired as dance groups. Their job was to play the songs like the records so people could dance. What happens at this gig is instead of all the nice groups who were there with their suits and their ties and being very, very polite, the
Hmm.
Beatles come in jeans, cowboy boots, leather jackets, everything turned up loud. Paul launches into Long Tall Sally and people stop dancing and they turn around and think, what the hell is that? They change music and they only do that because of what they'd learned in Hamburg. So if they'd stayed in Liverpool, they would have been encouraged to do what all the other groups were doing, which was to learn your songs, get paid some money, you play, and everybody dances. They learned that wasn't the way to do it because They were playing between 6 and 8 hours a night.
Hmm.
And if you think back then, most songs lasted what, 2.5 minutes?
Yep.
Well, how many songs do you need to fill 6 to 8 hours? It's a lot. So they learned to take a 2.5 minute song and make it last for 5, 10, 15, even 20 minutes. They started playing around and rearranging the songs
Yep.
and doing them how they wanted to do it. So when they play that gig back in Liverpool, they're doing their version of the song. They weren't just playing the song everybody expected to hear. It was their interpretation, their arrangement of the song. Suddenly, every local promoter wants to book them. But still, you've got that problem of, in 1961, they're kings of Liverpool and Hamburg, but there's no way of getting out. Nobody approved they could do it. So for me, no Hamburg, no Beatles. Now that's the title of a documentary film that we finished. It's out over here. It's about to come out in the US
Hmm.
uh, very soon. That's been working on press releases at the moment, so that's coming to US TV very shortly.
See, this
And
is all. Yeah. Go ahead.
no,
Go
I was going
ahead.
to say, and then from that, we've now done a stage play called "Shake It Up, Baby," which is running at the moment to rave reviews, which tells that story of this group of young lads who aren't particularly great as musicians. They're certainly not playing as a band, and how Hamburg completely transforms them. And if you don't have that education, we don't get the Fab Four eventually. And that's that progress of what they learned in Hamburg. It changes everything for them and makes them so unique.
What you just said fascinates me because as much as I've learned about the Beatles and their history, my impression always was in Liverpool, you had all these bands, but they all wanted to make it big on their own with their own music and try to work their music into cover versions and all. But you're saying most of these bands were doing it just for the gig, just for the work, just for the pay, without thinking about a future for them as a recording act.
Oh, there was no concept of that because in the charts over here, the hit parade as it was called back then, it was full of solo singers. The only group with guitars once skiffle had been and gone, and that was still the offshoot of jazz. There's only really the Shadows,
Hmm.
who for half the time are backing Cliff Richard, and the rest of the time are an instrumental group. There was no concept of a British group, guitar-based group that we now recognise, of going into the charts. It didn't happen, and therefore, all you could expect to do was work at your job during the day, and then go and play in the evenings, get
Hmm.
paid some extra money, and that was it. They weren't thinking of writing their own songs. Nobody was doing that. Now, John and Paul were different because that's one of the things they really connected on very, very early on
Yeah.
in their relationship. And what ends up, particularly in 61, is now they've gone from absolute nowhere to being the top band in Liverpool. When you've got 300 of these groups around, all cover bands, then you've got to try and find obscure B-sides, other stuff that no other band's playing. Because if you're going to be top of the bill and there's half a dozen groups on with you, you're standing there saying, that's ours, that's ours, that's ours. We can't do that. And that's why they then go back to songwriting and introducing their own songs in 61 so that they will stand out because nobody else was doing that. They were all cover bands.
Right.
And now they were doing their own arrangements. Everybody would start stealing arrangements off everybody else. So they had to try and stand out. So they brought this act, which they'd learned in Hamburg. They rewrote the rules of what a gig was. They changed the whole thing of dance bands. They dressed completely differently. And now, as the others tried to keep up with them, they start introducing their own songs. So again, they're standing out yet again.
Right.
And
And
all
also,
of that is in Hamburg.
they were also covering B-sides to singles, which
Oh,
were.
completely. Yeah. And that they were looking for obscure imports, which is why everybody was hanging out in Brian Epstein's store, especially,
Hmm.
and going through the imports. So there is also the story of the Cunard Yanks, the Liverpool Sailors who were bringing records back.
Right.
That's part of it. It's been blown to mythical proportions. It wasn't as great, but that's still a part of it. How can you find something new and different to differentiate yourself from another group? And doing your own arrangement of a song makes it yours, so you own it then. So they got that nice blend. But that's everything that they learned was Hamburg. You know, if you listen to George, George says the Beatles were at their best. They were the tightest as a band at the top 10 club in Hamburg. You know, they played 92 nights consecutively. And he said, that's it. We were so sharp. We were so tight as a band. It was a great club, great PA system, echo on the microphones. He said, that's when we were at our peak. Similar to what John had said, you know, if you
Right.
didn't see the Beatles in Liverpool and Hamburg clubs, then you never saw the real Beatles.
That's why we have to get Live at the Star Club cleaned up.
You know, partly yes, but I still love the rawness of it. And, and sometimes we can do too much cleaning up. So I'm torn on that one. It is a real tricky one because I love the rawness of that. But unfortunately, we don't have what they were like before because obviously they're now the Fab Four
Right.
and they're starting to become a pop group. I'd love to have got something from 61. Obviously, we got My Bonnie, but that's recording studio, but something of them live in 61. Wow, I'd love that.
When you talk about doing long versions of songs, a lot of that was due to Tony Sheridan, right?
Oh, completely. Absolutely right.
What did I say? They turned into like a 15-minute song.
Yeah. Yeah. And I knew he was great for that. You know, all the musicians called him the teacher. You know, playing with Sheridan at the top 10 club, that was their education. You know, what they sort of learned themselves in 60, then under Sheridan's tutelage, they suddenly blossom as musicians. And I think that's when they're giving touring up in 66, you know,
Hmm.
because they're bored of playing the same 9 or 10 songs for 25 minutes. They can't hear themselves. Everybody's screaming. Said, how can you develop as a musician? You know, when you're playing in a band, you react to how the crowd is, that atmosphere, and stuck in the middle of a baseball field and everybody's screaming. There's no enjoyment. Their enjoyment was when they're in Hamburg and Liverpool, they didn't have a set list until Brian sets them down and started formalizing a set list. They didn't have set lists. They chose what they wanted to play when they wanted to play it. And they had a catalogue up 250, 300 songs that they could just call, right, we'll do that. So they had fun. That's what kept them going
Right.
and developing as musicians. That period of 60 to 62, absolutely crucial to making the band.
How important was Tony Sheridan to them? I know that you say, and by the way, every time you bring up these circumstances, at the very end, you either say, let it be, or
Yeah, yeah,
tomorrow never knows when you're not sure, or the end. It
yeah,
would have been the end for the Beatles if this didn't happen.
yeah,
So you do say for Tony Sheridan, the end, because everything started with My Bonnie.
yeah. It's that record is crucial. It's the most important Beatles record because they'd learned so much under Sheridan because he was a star. He'd been on British TV in 1959,
Hmm.
so they knew who he was. He's one of the most famous British rock and rollers. He's now out there star billing. They followed him wherever he went. They learned so much from him because he was such a phenomenal guitarist, and he was the guy doing the arrangements. So I know with him being interviewed, like when they were doing My Bonnie, he said every time we did it, there was probably half a dozen different versions of how they did the song. His solo would be different every time. They had lots of different variations of slower intro, no intro, whatever. That's what they learned from him
Yeah.
was how to do it in a more structured, organized way. And they learned so much. But My Bonnie, if we don't have My Bonnie, then Raymond Jones doesn't walk into NEMS and ask for My Bonnie by the Beatles, which brings the Beatles to the attention of Brian. And if we don't have Brian Epstein, coming to the point we were saying just before, nobody else in Liverpool could get them out of Liverpool. Sam Leach was the only one who tried, and he had that disastrous um, booking down in Aldershot, beginning of December '61, when 18 people were there, including the Beatles.
Right.
That was his chance to show what he could do, and he couldn't do it. So if you don't have Brian,
Yeah.
they don't get out of Liverpool because Liverpool might as well have been in a different continent because London has this and still has that identity of everything revolves around us. All the media was there, recording studios were there. Everybody necessary for the music business was in London. They would never have dreamt of leaving London to go looking for talent because they were so important. Talent came to them. And if it didn't come to them, then it can't have been important. So you had to have somebody who could make that connection between Liverpool and London.
When it came to promoters and booking agents, didn't any of them have connections to record companies? Or
No,
was it just management, the managers of the
it,
bands?
no. The closest you got was when Alan Williams was dealing with Larry Parnes.
Yeah.
So right at the very beginning of the Beatles' career, and they're doing that audition for Billy Fury. Larry Parnes was the big national promoter, but he was only interested in solo singers. So he had half a dozen individuals that
Mm,
he managed. Then he just looked for backing bands to look after his singers. Nobody was looking for groups. It wasn't a thing. And so everybody had to come to London. So with Brian having Nems as the biggest record retailer in the northwest of England,
right.
Brian has the contacts. The only reason they get the Decca audition is because Tony Barrow worked for Decca and they're just about to chuck the tape back and he says, do you know who Brian Epstein is? No, he's Nems. Oh, right, we better give them the audition. That's the only reason because
Mm.
of who Brian was, because Nems were that important as a record retailer. Nobody else had any contacts, any connections in London.
What about, I'm just throwing this out
Yep.
there. What about a Bill Harry? I mean, somebody like him must have had contacts with record companies with the music paper that he had.
Nope. Because the music paper was for Merseyside. It was the first music paper of its type in the country.
Hmm.
And it just dealt with what was happening in Merseyside. It covered the local bands, where they were playing. Record reviews were done by Brian. It was all local. So again, it's still a microcosm of Merseyside was doing its own thing in its own bubble.
Right.
Nobody in London was aware of that because they never thought to think outside of London. As I say, it might as well have been 1,000 miles away, not just 200.
Here's a question that I've always wondered.
Hmm.
Since you mentioned Tony Sheridan,
Yeah.
how is it the Beatles got to record Ain't She Sweet and Cry for a Shadow? Wasn't this supposed to be like a showcase for having Tony Sheridan as a vocalist? How did they manage to get that in?
Because of the time that was allotted for the recording, because what they were doing, they were so good. Thought, oh, wow, we're here. Why not? So I said they'd done some auditioning time, and obviously we've gone through the whole thing of Bert Kempfert saying to Pete, "You can't play loud drums here," because Kempfert never used loud drums on any of his recordings. He
Uh-huh.
was into Schlager music. They called it easy listening.
Yep.
Um, so they'd gone through some stuff, and then he said, "Okay, what else have you got?" And I think that's probably why John picks "Ain't She Sweet" because it was such an old song, almost like an old standard.
Yeah.
That was sort of acceptable. And they said, "Okay, well, we've got here. Let's just roll it. Let's see what else is there," because they had to sign a contract with Kemper anyway for 12 months. So he thought, "Okay, let's just see what else is there while they're on the premises. Why not?"
So the intention was to really sign Tony and the band, not just Tony. This is just his backup band.
Yeah, well, because they were a package because most nights
Hmm.
it was the Beatles acting as Tony's backing band at the top 10. So for most of that period of that second trip to Hamburg, it was Tony with the Beatles. Then he'd have a rest and they'd do their own set. Then they'd do some more stuff together.
Uh-huh.
So when Kemford was brought in, he was watching Sheridan with his backing band performing. So he knew what package he was getting. Sheridan was the main star,
Right.
but they were his band as well. So he was a shrewd guy with Kemford. And it's like recording time isn't that expensive. If everybody's there already,
Hmm.
well, let's just run through what else you've got. Why not? Because you never know.
Why is it once the Beatles really broke big, they really were reluctant to talking about Tony Sheridan or Pete Best, for that matter? I mean, even to this day, their names are not really brought up unless you bring it up to them.
Yeah. Well, do you know, I asked Larry Kane a few years ago when I was chatting to him, and I said, you're accompanying the Beatles on the US tours. Did they ever talk about Hamburg? And he said, no, but we never knew to ask them. And that was the most important thing that I learned from Larry, from Ivy Davis as well, was because they spent their time as Beatles being asked so many questions, they just answered the questions they were asked. Nobody thought to ask them. Now, the second part of that was what I was saying before with Brian's PR was the Beatles are John, Paul, George, and Ringo, and Brian's the manager. Nobody else gets name checked. And one of the things that I'd noticed with interviews that Ringo had given, because he was late into the group,
Hmm.
if they asked about that, he never ever name checked Rory Storm and the Hurricanes. He would say, when I was with this other group and this other singer and this
Right.
other group, and that's what they would always do. They would never name check anybody else. And it's almost like today, if Paul's talking about the Beatles, he means the Fab Four. He doesn't mean the Beatles starting in 1960.
Right.
He means John, Paul, George, and Ringo. That was what was getting pushed. The Beatles are John, Paul, George, and Ringo with Brian as manager, and nobody else gets mentioned. And that's all the attention that way.
But, you know, today he's got nothing to prove here. He could talk about anything he wants. He could talk about anything pre-1960 if he wants to. He can bring up any names that he wants to. But, I just find it rather strange. It's almost like
Yeah.
that part of history never happened.
Funny enough, for the documentary No Hamburg, No Beatles, my role was archive producer. So I'm the research guy.
Hmm.
And I had to really go digging to find them talking about Hamburg. And I found some couple of times of television programs and radio programs that Paul had been on,
Yeah.
where he actually opened up talking about Hamburg. And one of them was just a BBC chat show. And it was when was it? He was promoting Give My Regards to Broad Street.
Okay.
And the interviewer had the whole program with him. And he started talking about Alan Williams and Hamburg and Pete Best and Stu. And
Hmm.
so finally there, but it's very, very rare. And that program was from, well, we're back in the 80s, aren't we?
84.
Yeah, 84 exactly. So it was very rare to find, but I had to really go digging to find any discussion of them talking about Hamburg and those early days. And that's, I think, was the best interview that I found. Of Paul talking very openly about what they got up to and other circumstances and the story
Hmm.
of Hamburg and mentioning Alan. Um, and I think it's a big frustration for me that Paul still doesn't talk about. He's been happy now to go back and talk about the Quarrymen. So that's okay. And he's talked about the Quarrymen a number of times over the years. But that 1960 to 62, been very, very reluctant to talk about because you're then not talking about Pete and you talk about Mona and you talk about the Casbah.
Uh-huh.
And therefore, you just sort of avoid that. No, the mere fact that Since Pete was kicked out in August 62, none of the Beatles ever, to this day, spoke to him, to Pete. I mean,
Which I
and
find so hard to believe. I know it's true, but
yeah,
yet at the same time, there was some kind of communication since Neil Aspinall had a relationship with Mona. So Pete knew what was going on, probably. I don't know how much Neil would reveal because he was a private guy, to the best family.
yeah, but he was, but then he was Pete's best friend and father to his half brother.
Right,
Um, I mean, Pete knew what was happening to the Beatles. That was because the whole world knew what was happening to the Beatles.
right.
Um, but yeah, there would have been obviously some communication, but probably not Neil talking to the others because that they wouldn't have wanted to know. Um, and I find that shameful. I really do. And it is one of those big disappointments I have that after all these years that they haven't been able to talk more about how important Pete and Stu and those 2 years were to the Beatles. Um, and that's why we've done the documentary and why we've done the play. And it's been interesting with talking to people having watched the play and they're saying, I thought we knew the story,
Mm,
but I've learned so much of realizing how important that time was for the Beatles. And they've loved learning about it,
yeah.
which is the most important thing, as well as enjoying it. Because, you know, you're going to have the best rock and roll soundtrack. But
Do you,
yeah, it's disappointing.
yeah. Do you think that part of the reason why Paul doesn't ever talk about Pete is because he thinks it might upset Ringo?
I don't think so. I don't think that would be a consideration for Paul, um, because Paul's always been very, very positive about how great Ringo was and is.
Hmm.
And I don't think there's anything he could say that would undermine Ringo. And this is the bit that's always got me, which I've never, as a Beatles fan, got my head around, that there's fans there who can't like Pete and Ringo. And I think, why? I don't understand that whole concept. You know, obviously, I'm a big fan of Pete and what he did, but yet Ringo's my favorite Beatle. I don't have a problem with that, you know, because I just think we'll give Pete credit for what he did. We're not trying to change history. My job as a historian is to tell history, not trying to change it.
Yeah.
You know, this is what happened. And there was always this time, as we see as you go through the story, was whenever they were making a change in the group, the right person came along. You know, the Quarrymen weren't going anywhere until Paul comes along. Then they go up a notch. Then they need a lead guitarist, so they get George and they go up a notch. They need a bass player, they get Stuart, but they still haven't got a drummer. They get a drummer. Then they go to Hamburg. But then, and it's the point that I made in my Finding the Fourth Beatle book, was for me when Pete leaves, and obviously I showed that he wasn't sacked. When Pete leaves, that's the end of the Beatles. And there's a brand new group called the Fab Four are born. They've gone from being this great rock and roll R&B covers band, who are the top band in Hamburg and Liverpool, but now they're becoming a pop group recording original music. That's a different band for me. Pete was brilliant for what they were doing there. Ringo was perfectly suited for the group they were becoming and proved that over and over again. And still, personally, I still think he's underappreciated for his role in the sound the Beatles created. So I don't have a problem with separating it, but I still think Paul does, which is a shame.
Hmm. Well, just to clear things up for people who didn't understand what you meant when you said that Pete wasn't sacked,
Oh, yeah.
what you're trying to say, and you say it in your book, is that when the Beatles, and actually, I have to bring up Mark Lewis in here because June 6th, according to him, was not an audition. They had already been signed at that point, so it really was their first session. But George Martin wasn't happy with Pete's performance, but he didn't say you have to get rid of him um, as a live band. But in the studio, I prefer to have a studio musician.
Yeah.
So apparently, George Martin didn't really explain that well, or Brian didn't explain it well to the group, and they took that to mean that they have to get a different drummer.
Well, first of all, it was an audition. They weren't signed.
Well, that's what Mark says.
Well,
There was already a
interested.
contract signed.
Yeah. So what I did was, in my previous existence in an insurance company, I did qualifications in English law and contract law. But even with that, I went and consulted the former senior lawyer in Liverpool, and I said, "This is my understanding, but correct me if I'm wrong." And I said, "For a contract to exist, you need an offer, you need acceptance, you need consideration, which is who's going to do what." And he said, "Don't forget the fourth part is the intention to create a legal relation." So George Martin had a contract sent to Brian unsigned. Brian signed his half of it and sent it back to EMI.
Hmm.
That contract was not signed by EMI until the 18th of June. And thankfully, the evidence is in Mark's brilliant book there, The Beatles Chronicles, where he has a copy of the letter where the secretary returns it to George Martin saying it's now been signed. So the contract wasn't signed until the 18th of June. Plus, everybody who was there on the day said it was an audition. So there was no intention from Parlophone's side, from the engineers, from George Martin, from anybody to consider them under a contract. It didn't exist at that time. It had been signed by Brian, but that wasn't a legally binding contract. So it's only after the session, and this is the important bit, where George Martin says to Brian, if I give you a contract, then we make a record, I'll bring in a session drummer, but it doesn't matter what you do with the group. It's just for the purposes of making the record, your drummer can't do what I need him to do, which was a normal thing back then, particularly with a first band, first contract. Using session musicians was quite normal.
Hmm.
But Brian was a record retailer. He wasn't in the recording business, so he didn't know what that meant. So when he goes to John Paul and George and says, well, it's looking good, but if we get the contract, then the producer doesn't think Pete's good enough to play on the record. On that basis, I understand the decision John Paul and George make. You know, they're still young. This is the very last chance
That's
of
right.
a record contract. And they're thinking, well, hang on, if we get the contract and the producer doesn't think our drummer's good enough, then we've got to change drummers. And they don't do anything until the signed contract comes through, which was signed by EMI on the 18th of June. And then still wasn't sent for another month. As soon as Brian gets that, the end of July, they start approaching the other drummers. And then they realize, how do we get rid of Pete? And of course, I interviewed Brian Epstein's lawyer, and he explained all these scenarios to me as well, being at the audition, when it was signed, how you get rid of him. And because they were a partnership, under UK law, you cannot sack a partner. And we'd always assumed that Brian Epstein employed the Beatles and therefore could sack Pete. No, Brian's got no authority to sack Pete because the Beatles employed Brian. So they had to almost trick Pete into thinking he's being fired without ever telling him he was being fired. And that's what they do.
I've got to get you and Mark on the same show because I know that's what he told me when Tune In came
Oh
out. That
no, no, it's in the book, and
yeah.
that's why I checked it out with other lawyers. But say, and thankfully, he provided the evidence in his Beatles Chronicles book because the letter's there saying when. So you can't have a signed contract until both parties have signed it.
Hmm.
Brian signed their half of it but it's not valid until EMI signed their half of it,
Right.
which was nearly 2 weeks later, 18th of June. So
Okay. Boy, I can talk to you for hours. But I want to stay focused a little bit more on these
yeah,
early
yeah,
years with when it comes to Alan Williams, since the
yeah.
Beatles had a lot of problems with him, why did he agree to keep working with him after they came back in 1960? Because of how the Beatles impressed him with Little in Town Hall? Was
They
that the
they
main thing?
they didn't have any problems with Alan. They were actually pretty rotten to Alan because with Alan and Lord Woodbine, again, who gets written out of virtually everything, if it wasn't for Alan Woodbine, sorry, for Lord Woodbine, the Beatles would never have gone to Hamburg. It's Woodbine takes Alan with him. No, he buys the van, he drives the van. Woodbine gets them out there. He's a mentor to them because he's the first singer-songwriter John and Paul ever met. So you got Alan and Woodbine as business partners managing the Beatles. So they're more than happy with Alan as the manager. They sign their contract with him. When they come back, it's Alan and Mona Best who get them the gigs. Then when they go back to the top 10 club, what they realize is the contract they've agreed with Peter Eckhorn hasn't included Alan's 10% as their manager.
Hmm.
So Eckhorn says, well, you're going to have to pay that money out of your own pockets. And of course, I think, well, why should we do that? And anyway, we walked down to the top 10 club and we agreed this, even though Alan has to sign as a guarantee that they're going to be good boys when they go back to Hamburg.
Uh-huh.
He does everything for them. Then you think, well, why should we pay him? And so that's when they send a letter back to Alan and say, oh, by the way, we're not paying you any commission. That's the reason
But,
they
with,
drop him.
but without him, they wouldn't have gone there.
Exactly. So how ungrateful is that? And it's one of those things when I first met Alan and we first talked these things through. He said that the thing is about them, particularly John, Paul, and George, is they were absolutely ruthless. And if you want to get on in the music business, you've got to be absolutely ruthless. And they were. And
Hmm.
so they were so ungrateful that they drop Alan and don't pay him any more commission because it would have cost them, even though he'd done everything for them. Yeah. Lovely boys.
And we love them to death, don't we?
Exactly. Exactly. And there were
Um,
times like with one of the options, you can't do that. Well, there's certain things they did when you think, no, you can't do that. You shouldn't be doing that. And they shouldn't have done that to Alan. They shouldn't. Alan couldn't have got them out of Liverpool. He knew that. Sam Leach knew that. All those promoters knew that. But yeah, they just dropped him. And that was wrong. But again, you've got to put in the context of how old they were or how old they weren't. Almost, all that they're dreaming of is getting to the next stage.
right.
And they would use whoever they needed to because they were that ruthless. They were that driven. And people also forget they worked that hard to get to where they went. You say to a band now, right, you're going to play for between 5 and 6 hours a night, 92 nights consecutively. You up for that? That's what they did in 61 in
Yep.
Hamburg, 92 nights consecutively. When they're getting back, they're playing 3 times a day. Lunchtime at the cavern, somewhere else locally, then coming back to the cavern again. They worked so hard. They had that single-minded stubbornness
Yeah.
that that's what they were going to do, and that's what they needed.
Well, they were driven.
They were absolutely by Neil Aspinall quite often.
At the same time, at the same time, I always remember in Mark's book, he said that by the end of 1961, they were ready to quit
Yeah.
because they were restless because they couldn't get any further than Liverpool. And they had so many gigs, more gigs than ever in Liverpool, and that wasn't enough for them.
No,
So,
exactly, and that was the problem. They were kings of Hamburg. They were kings of Liverpool. Now, where do you go next? No, because any of the promoters they knew, the furthest they would get would be into North Wales, which is just down the road. up the coast to Southport to Blackpool, maybe as far as Manchester, but
Yeah.
that's it. It's still local. They weren't satisfied with that because of that desire to keep pushing and pushing. They knew the next step was to get a record deal or else give up because they couldn't keep just going around the same clubs, doing the same thing over and over again. They were never happy just to sit back and like they did like with their records. They were
Yeah.
never ever prepared to sit back and say, "Oh, we've got a sound. People love it. Let's stick with that." That was never them, and that's what was driving them. By the end of '61, they'd achieved everything they possibly could. They've even got a record out in Germany, and Brian comes along just at the right time.
Yeah. And I even believe that to some degree, somebody like John, and to a lesser degree, George, got kind of bored in being with the Beatles because at some point, what's the next step? You're going as far as you can go,
Yep,
and you don't want to repeat yourself,
yep,
and that's part of the reason why they broke up, because John wanted something new,
yep.
you know. George, to some degree, felt that he was being held back and he was exploring other things like
Yeah,
Indian music. So, they didn't want to keep putting out the same thing.
no,
And that's part of the beauty in following the Beatles catalog right there.
absolutely. And that's why knowing the whole story, and that's one of the things Andrew and I were keen to do with this book was to do the whole story and to take those key moments all the way through and never saying, right, they reached a point where nothing was ever going to change. The story was constantly changing, and no other band has ever done that in a short space of time
Yes.
of that. It's remarkable. But you have to tack on them starting in 56. This
Hmm.
isn't just a 1962 story. It's
Right.
those earlier years, that evolution all the way through. Paul's just done a lovely interview for Colin Hanton's documentary called Prefab, which
Really?
it's, yeah, oh,
I didn't
yes,
know he
lovely.
gave one for that.
Yeah, yeah, lovely interview. Um, and he said, you know, there wasn't the Quarrymen, and then there was the Beatles. The Quarrymen became the Beatles. It's an evolution.
Uh-huh.
And he said it lovely and clearly. He said that's where it all started, but just it progressed all the way through. They just became the Beatles. It's one story. I thought, yeah, he summed it up really nicely on that. Very good.
So he met up with Colin? He spent time with Colin?
Well, he did do when he was playing in Liverpool a few years back, and it was
Uh,
Colin's 80th birthday. And I think through Frida, Colin went backstage and he had a chat and a catch up, and then Paul name checked him when they're doing In Spite of All the Danger. So
oh,
and Colin
nice.
Hanton's here, which was lovely, really nice thing to do. Colin was made up with that, and that's what it's an evolution all the way through, and they never ever wanted to stop until they decided they had to stop.
But Paul can't talk about Pete.
No, that never happened.
He can talk about Colin,
Exactly. So the Quarrymen is fine. There's no controversy with that,
Right.
unfortunately.
All right. Let's mention a few other things here.
Yeah,
Stu Sutcliffe. What
yeah.
if he didn't join the band? You talked about that, and especially in the case of their hairstyle and how Astrid did, you know, his haircut, and eventually George took it and all that. Although Paul always mentioned Jürgen Vollmer when it comes to the haircuts and not so much Astrid.
Yeah,
But
so Stuart has it first, and they took the Mickey out of him. And I think going back to what we were just saying about them getting bored towards the end of 61, when John turns 21 and gets £100 for his birthday, John and Paul just drop everything, including bookings for a whole week or more, with no notice,
right,
and clear off. And their plan was to hitchhike, go to Paris to see Jurgen, and then on to Spain. Now again, that just the whole thought of dropping and cancelling a load of gigs.
yes,
Yeah, they must have been at that mindset of, oh, what the hell, we can do that, which George and Pete were not impressed with. So they go to Paris, meet up with Jurgen. And of course, the original style which Stuart adopted, Jurgen already had because it was a French style.
Right.
And so when they're with Jurgen, John and Paul say to him, cut our hair like yours. So that's when they get that. So Jurgen's the guy who does John and Paul's in the October of 61 because Stu was already wearing that hairstyle. Of course, they come back and they make
Mhm.
George get his hair done,
Right.
hair done as well. So yeah, it's a French-German thing. But
So
Stu was really important, really important.
what if anything was Stu's influence on the group, other than being John's close friend and being a great artist?
And being a good bass player, and it's another one might get me on my soapbox about this because it's been made out that he was a terrible bass player, couldn't play, but was there just because he was John's mate. Well, when he first started, as any musician is, when they learn an instrument, they had to be taught. So at the very beginning, he's learning to play. But having spoken to, well, one Pete Best, who of course the rhythm section, Pete and Stu worked closely together, who said I had no problem with Stu at all. He was nice and regular and developed a really good style. But also when the Beatles go out to Hamburg and Derry and the seniors, who are still out there, Bruno Koschmider mixes all the musicians up and forms a couple of groups with them. So Howie Casey, the sax player, who of course later goes on and plays with Paul in Wings, Howie ends up in the group with Stuart, and he said Stuart developed a really good rock and roll bass style. Klaus Vormann, speak to Klaus. No, Klaus is inspired by Stu to play bass. And when Stuart quits, Klaus says, can I be the bass player? And said, oh no, sort of been agreed that Paul's taking over.
Uh-huh.
So Stuart could play bass. Now, being a bass player and playing with the Quarrymen as I do now, we do skiffle stuff, but we do some of the early rock and roll. If you're doing a lot of rock and roll stuff, it's 3 or 4 chords.
Right.
If you're just playing the bass note without any runs in between, if, for example, it's a straightforward rock and roll tune in A, then you only use 2 notes because you can play the open second string. In fact, if you do it in A, you could not use your left hand at all because you go from A, you go up to D,
Hmm.
back to A, down to E. You could actually do it without using your left hand at all. But Stuart developed and he learned that, and he was a decent rock and roll bass player. So he developed because after he quits the Beatles, he plays with another German band called the Bats in I think early '62. So he was good enough to play with other musicians. So the whole Stu was crap is another one of those great mythical stories, um, which sort of suits the narrative as to why
But
I think the
still,
big
you're talking about 1960 to 62 again. I don't think I've ever heard John or Paul or George ever say that Stu was even a decent bass player.
well, they haven't talked about somebody outside of the Fab Four.
I know, but why wouldn't John, Paul, or George ever say it? What
Well,
harm did it
Paul
come to them?
wasn't. Paul and Stu didn't get on, as we know,
Hmm.
and they ended up fighting on stage after Paul insulted Astrid. Paul's frustration, as obviously the most musically talented of the group, was in '61 after his guitar broke. He was stuck at the back playing piano, and he's arguing because Stu was then missing rehearsals, and he wasn't as dedicated. And going back to what we were saying before about how hard working and focused John, Paul, and George were,
Hmm.
Stu wasn't as focused on the music because art was so important to him.
Right.
And so he's missing rehearsals. The band's starting to get better and better, but he's not keeping up with them. That's why musically, Paul's getting really frustrated with him, where they end up having the argument. And then Stuart quits because he's got accepted into that Hamburg. art school,
Right.
and Paul takes over. But the thing it does for Paul, it brings him back to the front line. He's now back up front with John and George, not
Right.
stuck at the back on the piano. And to be fair to
Paul.
Paul, he then takes bass playing to a whole new level.
Sure.
And I think he can only do that because he's a guitarist, because he's such a good musician as a guitarist and a pianist. He doesn't want to just pluck the bass note and be done with it. He then almost reinvents the role of a rock and roll bass player and becomes so inventive and so creative. You cannot imagine anybody else in that role. But Stu did his job up until that point. But that's as far as he could have gone. To go to that next level, Paul comes in, and then it really start going up and up and up.
I understand everything you're saying, but I still wonder why, if Paul didn't want to compliment Stu for making his own progress, why couldn't John or George ever say anything? Especially John, who was so close to Stu.
First, it goes, how much was he asked about it? But it's one thing you learn about studying Beatles history with John. And I found it again when I was rereading Hunter Davis's official biography. And he says he's talking to them in 1967 and 68. They couldn't even remember how many times they'd been to Hamburg. They were stuck between 3 and 4 when it was actually 5. John's memory was shot. As a historian, John,
Mhm.
Paul, George, and Ringo are the worst eyewitnesses to Beatles history. They are truly because it was happening to them, and they were stuck in this eye of a hurricane. Everything's whirling around them. It's almost impossible for them, at times, probably to even know what country they were in,
Hmm.
because they were inside a plane, inside a limo, inside a hotel, inside a vehicle of some sort, into a venue, and out again. They toured the world and saw nowhere. They didn't have time to comprehend what was happening to them. And yeah, unless they were asked the right questions at the right time, you didn't get the answers from them.
It's one thing to expect them to know everything they did on a specific day
Yeah.
and where they were and all that. I'm just talking about making
Mm.
a blanket statement. Stu was a decent bass player. You know?
Exactly. I'm with you. I don't see what the problem would be, but it doesn't fulfill the mop top fairy tale that we all know and love, which is it's all about John, Paul, George, and Ringo and Brian. And that's what you stick to. And that's what they stuck to. And I think it is a shame. I don't think John ever got over Stu's death. It was one of so many tragedies in his life. But yeah, it's frustrating. And as a historian, it's frustrating. You go searching and searching, say, please come on.
Yeah. There were several instances you point out in your book on how the Beatles could have been arrested or were arrested.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
There was the shoplifting incident with John, where he
Oh
stole
my goodness. Yeah.
a mouth organ.
Yeah.
And also John and Pete, of course, for lighting a fire to the condom in the Bambino, and they were in prison for 3 hours. What about
I,
George being underage? You know,
exactly.
could he, you know, I mean, if any of those things, well, they could have been in jail for longer. Or in the
Absolutely
case of
right.
John could have gone to jail for that. So
Yeah.
many things could have changed just from that alone.
Oh, they could. It was Paul and Pete who were arrested. It's funny. We've got a line in the play where John says, "Hey, look at that! Funny. I was the only one who's well behaved. You didn't expect that, did you? Because of course it's Paul and Pete who get arrested. It's George who's sent back, and John thinks, "Well, I might as well head home." But that really could have been the end. I think one of the interesting ones we discussed was Paul's 21st birthday party
Hmm.
in June 63. They got a number one single, number one album, UK tours, transform and move to today. Paul's drunk. Bob Waller makes that joke, how was the honeymoon? Because he'd just been on holiday with Brian. And John, being blind drunk, beats up Bob Waller so bad that people had to drag him off and puts Bob Waller in hospital. And Billy J added an extra layer to the story because John insulted Billy's girlfriend. He decided because she was well endowed in the chest area that John would go, I can do that. So the girlfriend slaps John. So John punches Billy's girlfriend and he had to be dragged off her. Now, two incidents in the same night, it makes a small column well inside a daily newspaper. That's it. Can you imagine that happening today with an artist who's now nationally famous
Right.
and they do that? It's the end of the career because you get what do you call it, cancelled online now, wouldn't you?
Uh-huh.
There'd be pictures right across social media. That would have been the end of it. And they got away with it because in those days, the newspapers were looking for good stories and they got away with it. But
Hmm.
you can't do that. You can't do that.
And John and Pete were very lucky that they weren't arrested for mugging a sailor.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. They got
That was a
away with
great
that one.
story. I know Pete told it in Beetle, the Pete Best story.
Yeah.
A lot of great stories in that book.
And that's why that Hamburg period is so interesting because there are so many key moments when everything changed. Just that simple, like you're saying, of stealing the harmonica when
Yeah.
they're in Arnhem on the way to Hamburg. If they got arrested then, they never would have got to Hamburg. No Hamburg, no Beatles.
Uh-huh.
They, some of these things are small incidents, but the ramifications are huge. And that's why it's been so fun to do this. It really has.
Um, you asked the question, what if the Beatles didn't reform when they returned from Hamburg?
Yeah.
I mean, they had to feel so dejected.
Oh, completely. John comes home and goes to bed. He didn't even tell the others he was back.
Right.
Paul's dad makes him go and get a job. He has a Christmas job doing deliveries, and then he's working at a coil winders, Massey and Coggins, brushing the floor and stuff. And John has to convince him to quit that. That all the parents were saying, right, you've had your fun. We let you do that. It's not worked out. Right, get a proper job now. So the pressure from the parents was huge. And thankfully, with Alan Williams and with Mona Best, with the two of them saying, look, no, we'll give you places to play. Don't throw it all away. That was a big, big turning point, really
Right.
big, when it really could have been over.
See, the one of the questions here is what if the Beatles were not allowed back in Hamburg?
Mm.
Now, I could say to myself, well, they improved so much in 1960 in Hamburg. Wasn't that enough as far as becoming a really great live band? But then, if all you've got is Mona and Alan to promote them, they still couldn't have gotten out of Liverpool.
And they haven't had those 92 nights playing with Tony Sheridan and making My
Hmm.
Bonnie. And
Right.
that's the key thing. It was that second trip where they've gone from being a rubbish band with no reputation to learn to be a really good band, but probably still a bit disorganized, a bit chaotic.
Hmm.
Then they learn under Sheridan. Okay, let's take some of this, harness it, shape it, control it more. Learn then how to pace yourself as much as anything.
Right.
Instead of being going 100 miles an hour, no, pace yourself. Pick your songs, know when to do a fast one, a loud one, do a series of them, know when to quieten it down. All that kind of stuff they were now learning on that second trip. And of course, they get to record My Bonnie. So if they don't go back in 61 and they don't record My Bonnie, the knock on, as we were saying before, Raymond Jones doesn't go in and ask Brian Epstein for the record.
There's always the chance that one of their fans is there at the cavern and walks into the store and says, "Have you got any records by the Beatles?"
But if they were their fans, they would know they didn't have any records
Hmm.
because that was the rare thing. You see, no other group in Liverpool had a record. Even if it was only in Germany, it didn't matter. They were the group out of all the 300 groups who were active who could say, "We've got a record." That's why they stood out. So it makes a huge difference.
Okay.
It's one of the fun things that I like to do as a historian is doing it in context of when the event happens. Because the easy thing is to look back in hindsight and say, well, we know it works out, so therefore. The hardest thing is to say when any of these decisions are made, like the replacing Pete with Ringo, we know how it worked out.
Right.
What did they know when they made that decision in August 62? It was a gamble. It was still a gamble. Now, Ringo had sat in with them on 3 or 4 gigs.
Hmm.
That was it. It was a hope that it could work. They didn't know for certain if it would.
But they knew they were on the way up with
They
with uh,
had
with
they had a
EMI.
record contract. They had a
Yeah.
record contract exactly, which wasn't a great contract, but
Right.
what contracts were. All they had to do was what's recorded 6 sides, and if it goes up, you get a penny per record, split 5 ways. You've got to spare. You've got to sell millions just to make a few pounds.
A penny split 6 ways.
Yeah.
Luxury.
Luxury. You were lucky. You were lucky.
I used to dream of making that.
Yeah.
Um, I got to question you on this.
Yep.
Question, what if the Cavern remained a jazz club? You say that because of the other venues in Liverpool, this would have made no difference to their success?
Yep. Absolutely.
The Cavern was so instrumental,
Was it?
building the audience and everything to have a residency there. Don't you think the Cavern was important?
Not as important as it's been made out now.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah. Again, putting back to what I was saying before, the Fab Four, John Paul, George, and Ringo, discovered at the Cavern by Brian Epstein, the manager. Birthplace of the Beatles. It's not birthplace of the Beatles. The Casbah historically is more important to building the audience.
Right,
It's Mona Best gets the Beatles into the Cavern
right.
because they built up an audience in North Liverpool, but they needed to be in the city centre. They took their fans that they'd already made. They're the ones who then go to the Cavern because the Cavern doesn't start doing beat music till what, May 1960, and even then, they're still experimenting with it. As necessity because the beat music was taking over.
Hmm.
They become one of the last jazz clubs to finally go over to beat music. But it was a venue in Liverpool City Centre. There was nothing mystical about it. You know, up the road you had the Iron Door with a fantastic club.
Right.
You've got Casanova Club around the corner. You've got a dozen clubs within walking distance, any of
Would
which
any
had
of
become their
them
base.
would any of them have put up the Beatles for so many dates?
Yeah, because and the most important thing with the Cavern was not so much that it was the Cavern. It was because there were lunchtime sessions. The Beatles were the only full-time band. Nobody else was available at lunchtime because they
Hmm.
worked. So if there was a club offering lunchtime sessions, the Beatles would have been the ones to go there. The Cavern was fortunate that when Mona Best gets them into there for the first time, and of course they go in their leathers, Ray McFall nearly doesn't let them go on. He says to them, right, you've got 10 minutes to get changed. And they said, what do you mean changed? This is what we wear. Oh,
Hmm.
no, 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 this is the Cavern. Suits and ties. And he said, well, we ain't getting changed. And Bob Wallace says to Ray McFall, if you don't let them go on and play, you're going to have a riot. So he lets them break their cavern rules to go on and play in leathers. And of course, bring the house down. Raymond Fall said, right, give me every booking you can and wear what the hell you like. So again, that's a moment where the cavern could have lost it. But because that's the place where Brian discovers them and they make famous, the cavern then becomes the place. But it was just, it was another club in Liverpool. And there's so many things in the Beatles in Liverpool end up being, it goes to mythical proportions. Now, everything about the location, everything about it was ideal. It was the right place to be.
Hmm.
But Alan Sitner, who founded the cavern, said, without the cavern, there'd be no Beatles. The cavern made the Beatles. And John said, no, the Beatles made the cavern.
Maybe it was a little bit of both. Shouldn't the Beatles have been felt that they were lucky that they also had an afternoon show as well as an evening show?
Yeah, yeah, no, and it worked great for both parties.
Uh-huh.
But other clubs had lunchtime shows as well.
Yeah.
But there weren't many musicians who could do it.
Yeah.
I think Rory Storm and the Hurricanes were also professional. I think they were the first band to go professional. So they were around. So the Iron Door Club, and they'd just be billed as the Wild Ones. And that would be whoever was available. Normally a mixture of the Hurricanes and the Beatles who would play there.
Well, Cavern's always going to be a big part of history.
Absolutely right. Yeah, and I have no problem with that at all. And the best thing about the book, and Andrew and I decided this when we were putting it together, was we'll tell the bit of the story of what happened and then what could have happened. And at the end of it, we always say, we contend that this would have been the outcome. But the whole point is, feel free to disagree with us.
Hmm.
Because really, we could promote this book and say, finally, you've got a Beatles book with no definitive answers.
Must make everybody feel good.
Well, and that's the whole point about it, because
Yeah.
we're saying that this is what we think
Right.
the outcome should be. But if you disagree, that's fine. We have no problem with that at all. We've left some blank pages at the back. Make some notes on that. Disagree with us. We don't have a problem because we can't say for 100% we know we're right on everything. It still has to be based on what we know. We think this would have been the outcome. But it has to be speculation because it didn't happen.
Right.
And that's why it was fun. It was fun for us to do the book like this.
Hmm.
We had fun putting it together, having the conversations we've been having, particularly those people who've already bought it and said, oh, yeah, you could have done this. That, oh, yeah, we had at least 300 and we had to whittle it down. But it gets people into the mindset. And that's the fun of it. Enjoy it.
Let me just ask a few key questions here.
Yeah.
Some of the most obvious ones. Your opinion. What if they kept Pete Best? You think the Beatles would have been just as successful if they didn't have Ringo?
Depends what you determine as success. The Beatles, once they become a recording band, is all about John and Paul's songwriting, and then eventually George does as well. There's nothing really on the first two or three albums that was stretching anybody of Pete's or Ringo's ability. So it's difficult then to say what would have happened. But going back to what we were saying before, because of the group they were becoming, I think Ringo's backstory really comes into play here. Because he loved jazz, he loved country. He'd started in skiffle. Roy's done the Hurricanes playing Butlin's family holiday camp, is light entertainment. He played so many varieties of songs that once the Beatles start diversifying and you start getting Rubber Soul Revolver and beyond that,
Hmm.
I think Ringo had so many styles he could have called upon, and he did to do that. So it's so difficult to say because Peter comes straight into it, really into a rock and roll group. And yes, they had a variety of genres that they played as the Beatles, but he'd only been in a band for about 6 months or so, maybe 8 months before he's in with the Beatles. So possibly Ringo's experience of all the different musical genres works in his favour for that. So the Beatles were still being as successful, but would the music have been, from a rhythmic point of view, so creative? And I think that is the hardest point. And I think if you try and take John Paul, George, or Ringo out of any of the Beatles records, it wouldn't be the same.
Hmm.
Um, so in those early days, I'd say that there was nothing in those first two or three albums that the Beatles were doing that would have been beyond any decent drummer. Once they started going on, who knows? Because they were going up together, so they were learning together, and so that it's a difficult one to say because it's a real big speculation. But I just think in their story, the right person came along at the right time.
Do you think that Pete could have been as innovative a drummer as Ringo? That's that's
It's
the
hard to say, but I don't think I personally I can't say because of course Ringo wasn't the only drummer asked. I can't see anybody doing the job that Ringo did. Any other drummer, and we're talking like Bobby Graham.
right.
He was the first guy to be asked, who was one of the country's top session drummers and playing with Joe Brown the Brothers. Great drummer. But I think Ringo just had a style that was so unique and was so flexible, so adaptable. I don't think anybody could have done any better than what Ringo did. And nobody could have done it to the same standard. It would not have worked, I don't think, with any other drummer. I think he was the perfect drummer at the right time. I really do. I think, yeah. And that's why I still say I think Ringo's undervalued.
Oh,
He really is.
still to this day.
Correct. Yeah.
We'll
That's why he's
respect
always
it.
been my favorite Beatle.
Yeah. If Brian Epstein hadn't died, do you think that
That,
the Beatles
oh,
would have lasted longer? Hey,
yeah,
we've all
exactly.
questioned this.
Yep. Andrew and I spent ages talking about this one. And you think of really the point where the Beatles start to fall apart is when Brian dies. Because they'd always said they would never have another manager. When Brian was trying to introduce Robert Stigwood, wasn't
Right.
he? They only wanted Brian. And you have to think, okay, they'd already started working on Magical Mystery Tour. Would Magical Mystery Tour have gone out on BBC Two day after Christmas in black and white if Brian was in charge? Not a chance.
I don't think so. Yeah.
No. Would it have ended up the way it did? Would he have insisted more? He would have given the lads their head to do what they wanted. But yeah, I think that would have made a difference immediately on that. But of course, the big thing that finally splits them up is Apple and Alan Klein and that tearing apart between the three onto one.
Hmm.
If Brian's still in charge, then Apple would have been so better organized and better run because that's what Brian did so well. And that all fell apart after Brian was gone. So if you haven't got Apple running like it did, they wouldn't have been wasting so much money because Brian would have been on top of that.
And if
He would
Alan
have,
Klein hadn't entered the picture,
he wouldn't have needed him. He wouldn't have needed Klein.
yeah.
I mean, that's one of the interesting ones that I think it was Andrew came up with, and he said, "Oh, what if Paul doesn't meet Linda?" And of course, because when it does come to the Alan Klein situation, Paul wants Linda's family
Yeah.
to step in, who had that experience. But John had convinced George and Ringo. They said, "Oh, Paul just wants Linda's family involved, so we take against it." But if the Eastmans had come in, they knew what they were doing.
Yeah.
So I think that is one of the crucial moments is Brian's death. It really is. That's when it all starts to fall apart.
Your opinion, if John hadn't been murdered, do you think the Beatles would have reunited in any way, shape, or form?
I think possibly for one things like Live Aid, something like that as a one-off charitable thing, I think they would have done. For me, weirdly, I'm glad they never got back together because if you can say your final album is Abbey Road, how do you top that?
Hmm.
It's magnificent. And one of the worst things lots of groups do is after a break, get back together. And unless you're Oasis, who have made friends and are doing this amazing world tour at the moment, for most of the other groups who get back together, they're just going through the motions of doing the hits and stuff. And I think it's like one of the things you said earlier. By the time they split up, George has got so much material for it. He comes out with a triple album.
Hmm.
They were all developing their songwriting so much. There was far too much. And that's why, right at the very end, we say, okay, well, what if they get the agreement to do the solo work, but come back together and do a Beatles album, which is the sort of thing that Genesis were able to do.
Right.
They go off and do their solo projects and they do their music on the solo projects, but they could still then come back together, bring the songs they thought were right for the band, and Genesis do another album. That's what kept them going to all those years. So they could do solo projects and they could do band albums as well. If they were still talking to each other, then that's a possibility. So we've come up with, a couple of potential albums, like loads of us have done over the years. Take the best of the solo stuff in what
Which
particular
you
year.
did in the book too.
Yeah,
Made your own
yeah,
Beatles albums there.
yeah, yeah.
But for years and years, I always said they never would have gotten back together. But when they first spoke about what became the anthology,
Mm,
when it was The Long and Winding Road, they were talking about maybe they could do some incidental music
yeah,
for it. And since the three surviving Beatles worked on Free as a Bird and Real Love,
yeah,
and the two surviving Beatles worked on Now and Then using some
yeah.
of George's guitar work,
Hmm.
why wouldn't the four of them do a few new songs? That would be my thought about it, just for something special like that. I'm not
Exactly. Yeah,
saying
yeah.
I can never see an entire concert where they're just doing oldies.
No,
They would have to mix group and solo and keep
yeah,
current, you know,
yeah.
and
Hard,
relevant.
hard to do. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So no, I agree with you. I think that's what it would have been that they could get together. I think musically they'd all gone in so many different directions
Right.
after all that time to then try and then bring it back. Who's going to take charge of bringing their song to the album?
Hmm.
How many songs would they have? Well, how many hours would they spend?
Right. How
Doing
many
open a
songs
did
would
open a
George get?
jar. Exactly right. Exactly.
Uh-huh.
So,
Okay. So tell us about the play, Shake It Up, Baby, which runs only for like
two
another.
weeks. Yeah. So
Okay.
yeah.
And it's running at the Epstein Theater. Tell us about the Epstein Theater when it was developed and what does it look like now?
Well, it's an old theatre. It was originally Crane's, part of Crane's music store. It sold pianos, etc. And then became the Neptune Theatre. And it had run for years. Like when my girls were little, and they were in dance school every other year. They did a dance show at the Neptune Theatre. So it's a
Hmm.
theatre I've known for many years. Then the Liverpool City Council took over running of it, and then it's been shut for years and years and years. But quite a few years back, they decided to rename it as the Epstein Theatre after Brian. So thankfully, when we were looking for a theatre to put on the play Shake It Up Baby, they just announced that the Epstein Theatre was reopening.
Uh-huh.
So it's only literally just a few weeks ago they had the official reopening. So one of the first plays on there is our Shake It Up Baby. And we thought it's the perfect place to do it. You do a Beatles show on at the Epstein Theatre.
Right.
It was perfect.
Is there anything in the theater where any Beatles photos are shown or any kind of sign of Beatle connection, or is it just the
Oh
name?
no, no, yeah, there's photos up there, and of course, obviously, it's got the Epstein Theatre name out the front of it, and there's a bust of Brian's head, which sits in the main bar in there as well, a dedication to him.
Okay.
It's a
So
lovely
this is
theatre.
all about the development of the Beatles from 60 to 62
It's all about Beatles in Hamburg.
in Hamburg.
So it's when we were doing the documentary No Hamburg, No Beatles. Obviously, I was doing all the archive research and working out playlists and what music we could have, etc. And I just said to the team, because there's only a small team, a few of us there, and said, this would make a great play. Because it's a great storyline.
Hmm.
Plus, you could pick the best rock and roll soundtrack. And it could be so much fun. And that's what we've done. So we've got a great local writer, Ian Salmon, who's written a fabulous script. It's really funny. Um, all local actors, local director, Stephen Fletcher,
Uh-huh.
and the cast, again, local. And we decided to pick Alan Williams for him to be the narrator and to tell the story. So I then work as script advisor to Ian. So we developed the script together from that.
So did you pull quotes from Alan's book or what exactly as
Oh,
a
yeah, from lots of sources,
uh,
including I interviewed him several times. And of course, it's not just Alan. Then we got the various quotes over the years about Hamburg. There were lots of different people I've interviewed over the years. A lot of the material we got together for the No Hamburg, No Beatles documentary. So a lot of that research was already there. So we could transport it
hmm.
and put it on in the play.
So the actors that play the Beatles, are they performing in the play?
Yeah, they're the
Okay.
active musicians.
And so you're using some of the same songs that the Beatles used to do in Hamburg.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
That's the whole point. And it's
Okay.
to go from, which is really clever of talented musicians to be playing like a not particularly good band at the start,
Uh-huh.
and then you watch that evolution when they suddenly become absolutely brilliant, and they pick, we pick that Litherland Town Hall performance when everything changes. And it's great. So Alan does the narration, got lots of actors playing the parts. The Beatles then performing songs
Hmm.
as well. Lots of humour. Lovely, lovely part. Because obviously we cover Stuart's death. And it's really brilliantly done. It's so moving. It really is.
So if
So,
you're covering Litherland Town Hall, then you're having scenes in Liverpool.
oh yeah.
So do you have members of the Beatles families, characters playing them, or is it, oh, good. It's a lot of actors then.
Yeah. I mean, there's some actors playing several parts, but yeah, no, we've got obviously Alan Williams, his wife Beryl, Lord Woodbine, and then you've got various members of the Beatles. Obviously with the Stewart, we've got Brian Epstein in there as well. But obviously Bruno Koschmider from
Hmm.
Hamburg, um, Klaus, Jürgen, Astrid, got Stuart's mum Millie. So that there's all that story. So it covers that whole period right up to as they become the Fab Four, and then off they go.
What I like about the idea is it's the evolution of the band as
Yeah.
opposed to something like Backbeat. Were you a
Yes.
fan of Backbeat, the movie?
I liked it for what it was. It was really good entertainment. They captured the feel
Uh-huh.
of Hamburg, but don't watch it as a documentary. Don't look at it for history because it's not a historical film. Because I interviewed Ian Softly, the director,
Yeah.
many years ago, and he'd said he was only at the last minute he agreed to have the other Beatles in the film. He wanted it to be so much about Astrid, Stuart, and John.
Hmm.
They didn't really want the others in, but he was convinced he had to have them in.
to make it
So
more commercial.
yeah, yeah. So it's entertainment. It's a great film for the entertainment and capturing that raw energy, that feel. It's good for that. But don't watch it as a biopic because it's not.
Okay, so I guess your plans for the musical are hopefully to bring it to London.
Yeah, that'll be the next step.
Okay.
Yeah,
Are
hopefully.
there feelers out, or are you close
Yeah.
to that?
No, it's conversation. You have to have conversations all the way through and seeing how it developed. The key thing was put it on in Liverpool, do it a short run, get some reviews in. If it works and the reviews are good, and we actually had press night last night, so
Hmm.
we had all the reviews have actually been published today. So we got 2 5 stars and 1 4 star out of 5, and the write-ups phenomenal. So we
Great.
couldn't ask for more than that. I've been twice. I'm back there again tomorrow and the day after. Have a day off. About another 2 or 3 times next week as well.
Is it difficult getting musical clearances for the songs, or what?
No, theatre is so different to film. So different. Doing stuff for any films is it's so complicated and expensive. Theatre is very different. But of
Hmm.
course, largely the soundtrack is not Beatles songs anyway,
Right.
because it's heavy of all the covers that they were playing.
Hmm.
So and obviously build the crescendo of playing Twist and Shout. It's
And when the
brilliant.
documentary comes out, are there the songs in there too?
Yeah, yeah. There's music in there as well.
Okay. All
Yeah.
right.
So yeah, been fun to do.
I can't wait to see that. Okay. You got to bring it all over here.
Oh, I know. Everybody's telling me that, but it's the kind of thing that could travel, yeah, quite easily. It's easy enough to do. So hopefully, with this run, if we can then get it to London, there's no reason why then. No, we'd probably look at maybe take it to Hamburg. Would make sense. But bringing it to the States, oh yeah,
See,
that'd be good.
maybe you need a Brian Epstein to help you out to get you out of Liverpool.
Exactly right. That's what we need. We do have one. Very good. Our producer, Scott, is brilliant for that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, good luck with the remainder of the performances. I hope it goes over to London and then over here.
Yeah.
Make Connecticut your first stop, though.
It's obvious. It's obvious.
I'll settle
Forget,
for New York if you
is
like.
it? Forget Broadway, Connecticut. That's what we were thinking.
Hey, we're part of New England.
Oh,
You're
well,
the
there you
Old
go.
England. I'm the New England.
There you go.
It
It
makes
makes
sense.
sense.
Yeah.
You haven't got New Germany, have you?
No.
Okay.
All right. Well, David, thanks so much for spending all this time with us. And once
Pleasure.
again, where is that book?
You
Here it
haven't
is.
lost it
It's
again.
actually right behind you. Why do I
It's
even need?
behind me. Oh, no, it isn't. Oh, yes, it is.
Oh, we never did say who this guy was.
I know. Do you want
Should
to
we
tell him?
keep him guessing? They'll have to buy the book then.
Have to buy the book to find out.
No,
I'll let
really,
him.
if you want to tell them, you can.
No, I'll let him get the book and find out because he could have been the fifth Beatle. He really
This is
could.
true.
And a lovely guy who I interviewed many years ago.
See,
That
we got
could
to
have been.
talk about all these people that you've met through the years,
Yeah,
and sadly, so many of them have passed away.
yeah,
It's great to have archives like you do to go
yeah,
back to.
yeah. No, it gives me something to do.
Yeah. Thank you, David. Thank you for all the
Pleasure.
tremendous work you've done through the years. Good luck with the
Thank
musical
you.
and the documentary. Keep me posted. Keep us
Will
posted
do.
when all this is going to be
Yeah,
coming our way and other countries, hopefully.
yep.
Thanks to all of you for watching, and we'll see you soon. Take care, everybody.
Bye bye.